Would you say that transmission is the kind of primary teaching of satsang, or the foundational teaching of the whole thing?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. A- and and that which is aware of transmission even more so. But those two often
Okay.
go together. So ultimately, it's about what doesn't change. The thing about transmission is it's an experience,
Okay.
and that changes. But there's no way to say no to that, like what you asked. There's no, because it can't, because it is, something is being transmitted, even when the only transmission is the pointing to that which doesn't change.
Hmm.
But the strange thing is, let's say if like for instance, there are people who really, they say, oh Krishna, I love to go to your satsangs because, like, I'm thinking of Victor, who's not here, because the transmission is so strong. So for him, um the energetic transmission, the state change, is palpable for him. It's important for him. um but that isn't always true for everyone, right? So or even always true for anyone, even somebody who is tuned into that. Sometimes they come and they don't feel it either, and for whatever reasons. And yet, pointing to that which is aware of no transmission or transmission, that's really the import of satsang. The interesting thing is if you begin to bring attention there and begin to kind of look or do self-inquiry or follow pointing out instructions, then the state changes anyway. It's sort of the goddess comes to visit whenever you put your attention on her husband. It just happens that way. She shows up. But is that the main import? Is to have an experience of energy? Not really, but you can't say no. Certainly something. Hmm. I would say this, that complete transcendence is to go beyond energy or states, but um, if there's not complete transcendence, then it is about energy and states. It's really very much about that. Another way of saying it is that the goddess or energy or transmission is a kind of guidance. And the more you're in touch with it, the more you're on track. Um, but where is it bringing you to? It's delivering you to that which is beyond that in which all energy is arising, that which is aware of energy. Um, Otherwise, transmission can be even a trap. It can even be a trap because it becomes about feeling good, the expansion, the bliss. And if it becomes that, then it's about something that changes, that's situational, that can be there one day and then the next day not like that. Also, um, it becomes possible to fail at it, like to feel like, oh, I'm not doing right. I'm not feeling anything. I'm feeling contracted. I'm not. But if it's about the awareness of contraction and expansion, then even when you feel contracted and you feel like depressed or not happy or whatever, or in pain, you can just ask yourself, what's aware of that? And then you really are at the point. The point is what's aware of depression, what's aware of expansion, what's aware of contraction, what's aware of expansion. So in that way, that's really what satsang is about. But you can't altogether separate them. Does that make sense, Theo?
Yeah, just the tiny piece that I'm lingering with is yeah, is maybe that there might be a moment of seeing abiding as the awareness, but then it's sort of like a maybe a duality, sort of like you're like there's still that notion of like a separation in a way, you know.
Yes. Yes.
So
Yes. That's the thing.
maybe that's
And that's the thing
yeah.
about thinking of it in terms of energy. Because
Okay.
it's always, in a way, that's that's the definition of the difference between the goddess and Shiva. I mean, in terms of mythology, or in terms of using that language, really it's Vimarsha, which means reflection, and Prakash, which means light, to use more philosophical language in Trika or in Kashmir Shaivism. It's and Advaita Vedanta is it goes out of its way to say this is really about Prakash, it's about light, it's not about reflection. And Zen is like that too. So they both go out of their way. If you say, oh, I'm feeling bliss, they go, so what? What's aware of the bliss?
Mm.
That's so what? Bliss, that's not what we're not here for bliss. So they're like so, and Advaita too. So since is, you could say very strongly influenced, at least, or maybe you could just say this is an Advaita satsang, although it doesn't really fit into any mold, I think.
Mm.
But it's very strange because Papaji really always spoke to transcend the energy, always, like he just continuously. If you said, oh, I'm feeling so much energy and bliss, he would say, well, what's aware of feeling the energy and bliss? Like he would point you to that. But everybody, if you ask them to a person, why do you go to see Papaji? Because he's so powerful. His energy is so powerful. It silences your mind. It does. So it is kind of, being around him was a psychedelic experience. I mean, it was really powerful. Just being in his presence, it was very, very powerful. And yet what would happen is you would be in an altered state, and then he'd say, now what's aware of that state? So it's not as though the altered state was not part of the situation with him. It was very much a part of it. But he would make sure that that wasn't the point of it. Because then you just go home with a kind of attachment to the teacher. He's my connection. And I need my fix. I have to go to the teacher. Now, some of that's okay. That's fine. But if that's all you've got, then, in other words, if that's all you get it from the teaching, then it doesn't actually set you free, which is the Advaita critique of Kashmir Shaivism. The Advaita critique of Kashmir Shaivism is that people tend to focus on the bliss. And so much of what you're talking about is the bliss and the goddess and the energy and what's getting opened and all of that in Kashmir Shaivism, which it does talk a lot about that stuff, in the States and all of that people get lost in that in Tantra. And they forget the point, or they can lose the point of Shiva himself in his unchanging, unmoving, just consciousness part. And the critique of Advaita for the Tantrikas, when they critique Advaita, it's like Advaita, because the feeling senses, you're trying to pull people out of that. People will end up becoming intellectual. They're not actually feeling what they're talking about. It's they figuring out a teaching, and therefore it's dead, and you don't have any juice. But the best Advaita teachers have plenty of juice, and the best tantric non-dual tantric teachers do plenty of pointing out to Prakash, to that which doesn't change, even if you're embedded fully in feeling and in, in very aware of states. You're also aware of consciousness, not just in its moving vibration, but in that which doesn't change. Aware of the space, light, the invisible light, not just its reflections. So, Ramana was a very, very Advaita guy. But when he was like directly asked about this, he said, "Oh, it comes down to the same thing. They're really not separate. You really can't." And he was asked, and he said, "You cannot really separate." He said directly, "You cannot separate the goddess from God. You really can't do that, because they always show up." That's the thing. You always are experiencing something. If there's any you,
Right.
if there's no you, then there's no question, and it's gone. And then as soon as there's a sense of yourself, then you're experiencing something. Right? So, but then that's a state. See, even the way that's described, it's like then now it's talking about nirvikalpa, or, beyond any one or any sense of individuality. But the way it's language is like it's a state. It's like when you experience it and then you experience this. And that's because even when that's happening, all that it means is that Shakti is latent. It doesn't mean it's not there. It's just not it's just it's in potential. So the potency of consciousness, and this is now it's more like Kashmir Shaivism language, tantric language, that there's always potency of consciousness. That potency is always there, even if there's no sense of an individual. And but Advaita doesn't want to talk about that, because that is a teaching and that's conceptual, and so it keeps you out of that by thinking of that. So it's all very paradoxical, and it's a skillful dance or art or argument or skillful
Untangling.
What's that? Say again?
Untangling.
Yeah, it is that. It is
Yeah.
that. But I'm thinking about between the two different languages, it's like a skillful contest about who can point out. They're using different kinds of language, positive and negative.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, negative in the sense of non-existence. Advaita is more along those lines. All the language is not this, not that, letting go of everything, having nothing, and all experience is false. It's a false coin, because it isn't the thing, right?
Hmm.
And then the language of Kashmir Shaivism or Tantra is like hyper positive. It's like everything is the thing.
Hmm.
Yes, the thing is nothing, but it's also everything, and therefore everything is the thing.
Hmm.
So nothing's left out. Everything, all of it. And every experience you have is real. Why? Because Shiva is real, and that experience is Shiva. Wow. Even things that are experienced as a Shiva. But that's the goddess. Yeah, in the goddess is Shiva. Oh, okay. That's all. Yeah. And is it an illusion? They'll also say, yeah, it's an illusion, but not in its essence. It's a real illusion. It's like an illusion that's actually happening to somebody. It's really experienced. It's not that there's no such thing as ignorance. There is, but the very being of it is real. It's like you can't just, and in Advaita, they like to say the opposite. It's going up the mountain from two different ends, but they always meet at the top. So that's what Ramana used to say, things like that. Comes down to the same thing at the end, although the language and the approach is different. But every once in a while I heard him critique the tantric way, but sometimes he sounds extremely like a tantrika. There's whole books that I have where he Shiva Shakti, it's all he's talking about. So yeah, it's about transmission. And it's not too. But even when it's not about energy, it is about transmission of something. It's about pointing to something. But like I said before, even if you do that, there's going to be a change in the energy, and you're going to feel it. The field is affected.
Yeah. I definitely feel that. And so that's, I guess, and after you mentioning the pointing, it ignited that kind of question in me.
Okay.
Because when words lose their meaning, what's left is sort of, I guess, well, just what's happening. But if there's that sense of I, it kind of like, tries to
own it somehow.
Own it and encapsulate it and say that's it and that's this. And yeah. So
exactly.
And then you're out of it. And it's this dog chasing its tail kind of thing.
Right.
Feels like, in a way.
Even right. And what you're describing is part of the thing. Like in Advaita, it's almost like transmission is just considered a side effect. So don't put your attention there. But it happens big time. But it's a side effect. Whereas in Tantra, it's the thing. It's like the transmitter. You're trying to generate that stuff and kind of use it as a way to climb the ladder of transcendence, to become more and more expanded. Right? So it's a weird thing. Like in Advaita, the thing is like, for the sake of having no ego, don't grasp it. Right? And so now, of course, don't grasp it. That's an ego not grasping it, right? So there's still ego for an Advaitin, but the path is of letting go of ego. Not so in the Tantric school at all. It's not about letting go of the ego. In fact, it's about kind of expansion of the ego, because what's let go of is not the ego, but what's let go of is limits on the ego. Like the ego, the whole idea in Kashmir Shaivism, as I understand it anyway, is for more and more expansion of the ego until finally you got God's ego, which is the goddess. So the sense of yourself is the goddess, because that's the sense of Shiva's self. I mean, and that's understood to be true all the time. Like the sense of the ego is a limited form of God's ego. Your ego is kind of sectioned off, dumbed down version of God's ego, and so you remove the things that keep it stuck, so that it becomes more and more expansive. So then it's like, I am Shiva, I am the thing, I am the whatever, like but your own sense of yourself is gone. So even though, I mean, in both cases, it's sort of like, the irony is that if you embrace the ego that way, it dissolves in terms of the personal ego or your own ego. It becomes inseparable from Shiva's ego. And in Advaita, it's like you can't let go of the ego altogether. So you're dragging it behind. And then at some point, I mean, that's what I am that means, right? So in Advaita, it's I am that. But what is that you are? It's the goddess, really. It's the I amness. So, different approaches. They both really transcend the mind in the end. The end language does not contain either one of them. One is like, we're going to use language and all of that stuff, all that energy, right to the end. And the other is, we're going to let go of that as quickly as possible. And the one that lets go of it as quickly as possible at the end, like Ramana was very clear about this. And this is when I was like, wow. Because at first I was like into Ramana and just thinking in terms of Advaita. And then I started coming across him saying things that were like, oh my God, this is, and it was like really Tantra. He say things like, I only tell people that they're not their body so that people will no longer, identify themselves with just being this body or this mind. But really, when they let go of being this body and this mind, they expand. And yes, this body and this mind are inside consciousness, also the couch and the chair and everybody else. So you most certainly are the body and the mind, but you're also everything. You're not just confined to that one body and mind. So that's like, what? Then he goes, but so, and he literally said, so you really are the body and the mind, but not in that confined way of just being this body and this mind and not being everything else. So you can't help but be everything else, even if you let go of everything. So you end up being a tantrika in the end. You end up being the whole thing. But you're not striving for that.
Yeah.
Whereas for the tantrika, the more you expand, finally, the you that keeps expanding just dissolves. Because if you're that vast, there's no you anymore in that usual way. Because you're so expanded. So you're like, I'm going to hold on to the ego to the end. Well, okay, well, in order to hold on to the ego, you got to stay at this level. No, I'm going to expand further. Ooh, and then there's no personal ego. It's Shiva's ego.
Yeah.
Right? But it was never, but you realize, oh, but my ego was never anything other than Shiva's ego. Or as Ramana said, my body and mind are, yes, yeah, I'm that too. And but I always was all of this in that sense as well, and beyond it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's the same, it comes down to the same thing, but it's how you map it out in terms of getting there.
It's like just my ego is Shiva's ego. In other words.
Well, it's a little piece of, your ego.
A little minuscule thing. Yeah.
It is Shiva, but it's like in a mini version, just like a bound version. So the more you can release the limits on it, the more you actually are. And that's a way of talking, because ultimately you realize all of it, even as limits, was always Shiva. But you really realize that when you are more than those limits. And that's releasing it. Really, that's in a big way, simply being. Not anything in particular, but just allowing being. Allowing sensation. Allowing the senses to relax into themselves. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you call it Tantra or you call it Advaita. It doesn't matter what you call it. You are already freedom itself. And freedom has the capacity to contract and feel itself to be separate from everything and do things. That's has that capacity. Always. It has the potential. But you are inherently free, not in the sense that you have to always be expanded, but in the sense that you are free to be any of those states. So your inherent nature is freedom. Not a particular state, expansion or contraction, but freedom. And that ends up, like, hearing that, knowing that, feeling that, ends up in a huge release, which is an expansion. So you can't help yourself. You end up expanding. And bringing it to mind or speaking about it. Just like if you start to think about what your bills are and your so-called problems and your landlord and this and that, then you suddenly find yourself anti-satsang. You're like, oh my God, shit. You can do that too. You talk about it. You bring it to mind. You cling to concepts. I mean, I feel like what it ends up being is that more the skill, you could say, or the freedom ends up being the capacity to be what is appropriate or necessary for any given situation. But not right away. There's skill in that because we get caught, like, okay, I need to pay my bills and do this thing. And then there's the thoughts that are related to fear and this and that. And it feels like an entanglement. After more and more of I'm that and I'm this, then the fluidity becomes more apparent. Okay. I'm talking too much here. Thanks so much, Theo.
Yeah.
Mm.